American weapons and fighter jets were sent to the kingdom last year after Saudi Aramco oil facilities were attacked. They were also intended as a deterrent as tensions rose between Tehran and Washington. But the reduction in the U.S. military presence is believed by some to be based on assessments Iran no longer poses an immediate threat to U.S. strategic interests.
I don't want to talk about it, but we're doing some things. We're making a lot of moves in the Middle East and elsewhere. We're doing a lot of things all over the world militarily. We've been taken advantage of all over the world, our military, and in the sense that and this has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia, this has to do with other countries, frankly, much more. We have the most powerful military.
It's certainly not a rotation. It's in terms of a normal routine operation. Saudi Arabia may have taken American support for granted a bit too much, certainly from Donald Trump, because the oil price deflation that was caused by Mohammed bin Salman really impacted the United States oil economy and many of Donald Trump's core constituents. So President Trump may very well be sending a message as well that don't take us or our protection for granted.
Mohammed Marandi in Tehran, how will this be viewed?
We see it as being very important, and I don't think that Iranian policy pointed out because of the oil policies pursued by Mohammed bin Salman, which has been very destructive to the U.S. oil industry. But for the moment, it's not even clear if the Americans are really going to decrease their presence in Saudi Arabia. We have to see what happens.
Under Barack Obama, Trump did promise that he will continue this. Maybe this is one of the points he agreed with Barack Obama. However, when it came to the Saudis, he was very cautious because he was about to build strong ties with Mohammed bin Salman. So he was a little bit hesitant, and we saw at the beginning of his presidency that how he basically tried to avoid any kind of confrontation with Saudi Arabia when it comes to troop relocation. Actually, he sent troops to Saudis in 2 times in the last 2-3 years because of the Saudi perception of this Iranian threat. So basically what we saw is, I would say, it's a step within a context with that the withdrawal of the American troops. However, this step, it came in the context of oil prices and the Saudi action, which being perceived by the Americans, I would argue again, that it being perceived by a Trump administration that's hurting the economy, hurting the base of Trump in the year of the elections.
Jill Rubin in Maryland, that's the simple...
Yeah, that is clearly the immediate touchstone that just happened. But taking even a step back in terms of American-Saudi relations, they're at a low point. On Capitol Hill, we've seen in the past year 2 major bipartisan votes that sent legislation to President Trump that essentially were saying, don't follow the Saudi lead on policy in the Gulf. And President Trump vetoed them. But I'm referring to the War Powers Resolution that just this past week, the president had to veto, which was about preventing him from striking Iran, which in many ways is buttressed by the idea of protecting Saudi Arabia against Iran. And then the other one a bit earlier, about half a year ago, which was the War Powers Resolution blocking American military equipment from being sent to Saudi Arabia for the war in Yemen. That too was vetoed by President Trump. But there's real bipartisan pressure coming from Capitol Hill against President Trump on Saudi Arabia. And as our colleague in Doha has said, President Trump has been trying to work with Saudi Arabia despite that, but maybe this just is a bridge too far to try to essentially destroy the American oil industry in the midst of a pandemic, which goes right at the heart of Donald Trump's core voting constituency. That really showed a lack of judgment by Saudi Arabia. And President Trump got pressure from Capitol Hill saying, why are we protecting this country so much if they're willing to undermine our industry here at home?
Mohammed Marandi in Tehran.
I think the important thing that has to be taken into account is that the mess that we have in this region, when we look at it from Tehran, is due to the U.S.-Saudi alliance. And of course, there's always Israel in the background. the whole menace of Al-Qaeda and Wahhabi extremism came as a result of the US-Saudi alliance in Afghanistan. And then the United States and its allies used this same tool in Syria, as we know from the US Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 and General Michael Flynn's interview on Al Jazeera, where he made this very explicit and he pointed it out. But despite the fact that after 9/11, many in the United States were raising these issues, but after a few years, again, the United States went back to its addiction to using Saudi capabilities with regards to such extremist groups and use them across the region. So the Iranians believe that if the United States ended its, let's say, the usage of such extremism, and if the United States ended its threats for sovereign and independent countries in the region, many of the problems wouldn't exist.
Peter, the game started early, actually, when it comes to the oil price. But I would say that the issue is about politics. It's about, the need for each side to the other side. I mean, if you look at what happened in the Saudi-Iranian relations and the Saudi-American relations, it's obvious that the Crown Prince wanted the American administration to support him becomes the king, and Trump wants the economic support of Saudis so he can be re-elected in November 2020. So this kind of give and take between both sides was working very well, I would say, until the beginning of 2020. And I think the epidemic and the corona crisis was invading the world. I think the Saudis maybe did not read it well, or maybe they wanted to pressure Trump to do something when it comes to some regional issues, including Iran. And I think they misread the American politics under Trump. They think he's an adventurer, he can do everything, he will not be calculating his steps. It appears to be actually no. In this year, he was actually reading his steps and he was rethinking about some of his steps when it comes to the region. He said, I will not fight instead of anyone. Saudis, they have to solve their own problems. And we remember here what happened in Aramco. He said, I'm not defending Saudis. And that was a very clear message to the Saudis. And I would say the Saudis got a very clear message that the Americans, they will not fight on behalf of them, and they will not actually enter a confrontation with Iran on behalf of them. And I think that was a reason, I would say, pushed Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman to do, to play with the oil price and to do this, to pressure the American administration more and more, maybe assuming that they will be changing on American politics. I think they misread the whole situation.
Joel,
and that's lurking behind the scenes in terms of assessments here in Washington about what's really driving the Trump administration's policy towards Saudi Arabia, because they don't have the support of the body politic, of the Congress, and they really don't have a rationale for many of the decisions regarding Saudi Arabia and the murder, for example, of Jamal Khashoggi, where it's still unresolved from an American perspective, and President Trump seems to want to kind of bury that. And so he's taking continual political risks, President Trump has, for Mohammed bin Salman, and it's just not gaining him many fans here in Washington. But I do want to also note that it's very important for what the Trump administration is doing to not be misread by Tehran either. This is not a move to somehow abandon American concerns about Iran in the region as well. Just this last week, we saw nearly 400 members of the House of Representatives from both parties sign on to a letter calling for an arms embargo, continuation of an arms embargo against Iran. So there are real concerns across the spectrum. But when it comes to American-Saudi relations, I do think that the pandemic is now creating an inflection point for American activity in the Middle East. We are not going to be looking the same at the region going forward as we were in the past years and decades. The priorities are going to have to be made. Hard choices are going to have to be made. Resource allocation is going to be very difficult with all the debt we've now piled on from the economic collapse here at home. So the Saudis may have pushed it a bridge too far and burned their best friend in Washington.
Mohammed in Tehran, coming back.
No, first of all, I don't consider Iran to be a regime. A regime implies some sort of illegitimacy and instability. The Iranians have a constitution, and the Revolutionary Guards, the armed forces, and the foreign minister and foreign ministry all work within the framework of the constitution. The Supreme National Security Council makes the final decisions on all these issues. So there's no independent actor here involved. I think, though, the key problem is that Saudi Arabia is being run by a person who has been destroying the country. Mohammed bin Salman, from the beginning, when he kidnapped and beat the then Prime Minister of Lebanon, the siege on Qatar, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi inside their own consulate, and of course the list goes on. And of course what they've now done with the oil market. This has damaged Saudi Arabia both politically but now economically. And ironically, the only country in this region that hasn't been hurt by the coronavirus, except for the direct impact of the virus itself, is Iran. Iran hasn't been hurt because Iran has been prevented by Trump, ironically, from exporting oil. And because of the sanctions, Iran has not had a very powerful tourist industry or an airline industry. It hasn't been able to trade easily, so it's been increasingly producing at home, being independent of the international market and the international finances and financial centers and financial sector of society, of the international order. So Iran has been largely business as usual, except for the problem with the virus itself, which everyone is dealing with. But on the other hand, Iran's adversaries, countries like Saudi Arabia, have been badly damaged. Okay. The United States is facing economic catastrophe. And therefore, relatively speaking, Iran's position in the region is, and its allies by extension, is much greater than before.
Okay, Mohammed, thank you.
And dangerous to say that Iran has not been impacted by the coronavirus. Iran has over 100,000 cases, according to the World Health Organization. Thousands have died. Many Iranian Americans here are very deeply concerned about their family members in Iran. And Iran has also been seen as the source of the virus in parts of Europe. So we need to have facts in this debate. I'm not going to debate whether or not Iran, from a regional perspective right now, as a result of these Saudi moves, has gained a bit of an advantage. But the coronavirus is not something we should be playing politics with.
Let's go to Mahjoub Zweri here in Doha. Mahjoub.
I think, Peter, the Saudis are worried of a major shift in American politics, brings a Democratic gain to the White House. And that may actually influence future political decision from now towards November. And that itself may have impact on the relations. But the damage in the relation took place in the last 3-4 months, absolutely strong. And I think the Saudis has to do a lot to rectify that damage. And it's unfortunate that, economically they are collapsing. I mean, the report, the press conference of the Minister of Finance was absolutely painful to the Saudis and what they need to do. I think this will affect the foreign policy of Saudis and any role they will play in the future in the region. But the major thing when it comes to Washington, Riyadh, we may witness some changes, but this will be very, very, very slow, and it will need a lot of efforts from both sides.
Okay.
This will rely basically on Kushner, Mohammed bin Salman, personal relations in particular.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to point out that the United States has been using the virus as a weapon against the Iranians through the sanctions. And despite that, the situation in the United States is catastrophic, and the situation in Iran is much better. And with regards to the spreading of the virus, Iran has far fewer flights, whether to China or to Europe, than the Chinese, the Europeans, or the Americans. So I think it's quite clear that that accusation is not true. But I think that what Iran is saying is that the United States has to recognize that its policy in this region is destructive. It has helped the Saudis destroy Yemen. It has allowed the Saudis to do this. It has allowed the spread of extremism across the region, whether in Syria or Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And the United States has to rethink its policy. The region has changed, and many of these peoples are resisting the Saudis and the Americans. And the Americans can blame Iran all they want, but the fact that they cannot suppress the people of Yemen, and the fact that they cannot impose their will in Iraq and Iran and elsewhere, shows that the United States is a declining force, relatively speaking, and it should start to respect the players in the region rather than dominate them.
I really hope so, in terms of making this White House wake up. I agree with the assessment here that our policy right now in the Middle East regarding Yemen, regarding these kinds of dealing with the fallout of the Khashoggi affair, the policy towards Iran, which is not advancing our goals, these need to be right-sized. And we've been following Saudi's lead, and certainly the Gulf tensions as well over the years. We've been following Saudi's lead without question from the White House, but not from Congress. And I think that's where we're finally seeing an endpoint here, with the different votes, the bipartisan pressure, the recognition now in the actual voting constituency of Donald Trump that there is a problem here. My hope is that this will be a wake-up call, that the administration will straighten out our policy and get us back into a position where we can really assert our goals rather than be following Saudi's lead into disastrous outcomes. That is the hope, of course, but in an election year, in the midst of a pandemic, it's going to be hard to see the whole ship steer, but certainly this narrow recent episode of the Patriots is an indicator, and it should be an indicator to Mohammed bin Salman that there is not much time left for him to change the way Saudi Arabia is engaging the U.S. in terms of how we activate our interests in the region.